Welcome to the Church Renewal Podcast. My name is Alan Edwards. I'm your host and the Director of Operations at Flourish Coaching. At Flourish, we exist to set ministry leaders free with the gospel to be effective wherever God has called them. So when pastors and churches get stuck, Flourish coaches come alongside them and help them get some strategic clarity and really renew their hope in the gospel. Today on the podcast, we are introducing a series within our Church Renewal podcast that we call Renewal Stories. So if you've been listening to the podcast, you know that we do questions and answers episodes. We do Renewal Voices episodes where we feature thought leaders who are trying to impact the health and vitality of the Church of Jesus. But we also want to tell the stories of people who have experienced personal gospel renewal in their ministry and have tried to lead renewal and revitalization and replanting where God has called them. And we thought that the best thing to do would be to peel back the curtain and let you know why we do church renewal at Flourish. So today's Renewal Story episode will feature Flourish Coaching Executive Director Matt Bohling. We'd love to hear your story. So feel free to reach out to us at flourishcoaching.org or find us on Facebook or Twitter, Flourish Coaching 1. You can always reach us by email. I'm Alan, ALLAN, at flourishcoaching.org. All right, let's dig into the ways that Jesus is renewing his church through renewal stories. All right, Matt, welcome back to the Church Renewal Podcast. How you doing today?
Great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to be back together again. We haven't been together since we recorded episodes about a month ago, 2 months ago.
2 months ago, yep.
Yeah, so listeners, you don't know, we try to record a few at a time, release them over time, and Matt and I try to keep a continent between us as much as possible.
Keeps us from hurting each other.
Matt, we are starting our first episode in the Renewal Stories series. People have asked us, they've asked us quite bluntly, hey, why should we be listening to you guys talk about renewal? Who are you? Who are you people?
Who are these yahoos?
It reminds me of that vice presidential debate. Who am I and what am I doing here? But let's tell your renewal story, Matt. How long have you been working in this space of the renewal and revitalization of Christian churches?
I got dragged kicking and screaming into it 18 years ago.
Yeah, 18 years ago.
Completely unintentionally.
All right. Yeah. So I used to hear a pastor talk about his conversion that way, that he got dragged by the Holy Spirit.
Kicking and screaming.
Kicking and screaming into conversion. You've mentioned here on the podcast a couple times that you did not grow up in a Christian household. If we're going to talk about your personal renewal story, we should probably talk about the way that Jesus first encountered you and renewed your heart and life with the gospel. Where did you come to know Jesus?
So I grew up in rural upstate New York, and my family sort of pronounced détente on religion. But I had a lot of Christian friends that loved me and were thoughtful. They shared the gospel with me. And that really came home about 6 weeks into college. The last penny to drop was God the Holy Spirit convincing me that I was a sinner. And so that happened about 6 weeks into college, and I came to repentance and faith all by myself one night with nobody else there and no idea what I was doing. And I told my friends up in New York, hey, what you've been trying to tell me, I'm actually believing. And so they sent devotionals and Bibles and tried to help me from a distance. I still thought Christians were mostly crazy. And so I didn't know how to seek out a church. I didn't have a vehicle. I wasn't really talking about it that much. My roommates were not too jazzed about the idea. And so anyhow, about 6 months later, I had the first of a couple of experiences that have really been what's shaped me as a person and calling it a ministry. About 6 months after I came to Christ, I looked out of my dorm room window, and walking across the quad in the dorms was one of my professors. It was really unusual because the academic buildings were a long ways away from the dorms. And so I kind of went out to him and I'm like, why are you here? And he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out a little yellow booklet and he says, well, I was kind of hoping to share this with somebody. Can I share it with you? I'm like, sure. So we sit down at a picnic table and he shares an old gospel tract that Campus Crusade used to use called The Four Spiritual Laws. And he gets all done with it. And he says, well, what do you think? And I said, well, I believe all that. I became a Christian like 6 months ago. And he goes, really? And he says, oh, you should come join us. We've just started this Campus Crusade chapter on our campus. So catch this. So this guy's one of my professors. He's the faculty advisor for the Campus Crusade chapter, and he's a ruling elder in the denomination that I'm now ordained in, the PCA. And so, in very quick order, in that one interaction, the next 20 years of my life was mapped out.
Wow.
So I got baptized in the PCA church. I became a leader. I grew and became a leader in the Campus Crusade chapter. Then I was a missionary with Campus Crusade. That's how I met my wife. We were both missionaries with Cru coming out of college. And so, it was, we sort of got drawn into that. While I was a missionary with Crusade, I worked at their headquarters in Orlando. And when I got there, there weren't any PCA churches that were nearby. I lived very near the airport, and they were all too far away. I was a typical college student involved in a campus ministry. Church was more than a tack on, but it wasn't really where I got my fellowship and my growth. It was really in the Campus Crusade chapter. And when I moved to Orlando, I'm like, you know what? Let's act adult here, right? Let's actually go to a church and be involved in it and have it be my place of home. And so I looked for another solid evangelical church, and I walked into an evangelical free church 5 weeks after the church planter did. And he had a Campus Crusade background, and we made fast friends, and he just grabbed a hold of me. And for 2 years, he invited me to walk side by side with him as he planted this church.
Yeah.
He drew me into leadership. He took me to trainings. I ended up doing the premarital counseling for my wife and I, and it was at a table at the Denny's just north of the airport in Orlando that he leaned across the table one morning. We used to have breakfast there periodically, and he said, "Matt, you really should think about going to seminary." It was probably the seventh time that he'd said it to me, but it was the first time that I heard it. And so the Lord really used him to push me towards, because I hadn't really considered, I'd had some inklings. That's a longer story for another time, but I had some inklings of maybe where God was drawing me towards, but that affirmation from within the body of Christ, right? That we call it external call, right?
Sure.
Was really a good affirmation. And so before my wife and I were going to get married, we had an option to go together as a married couple and work with Crusade, or to go to seminary. And so we ended up going to seminary.
Yeah. So you are in this church plant, going to seminary. Are you thinking about church planting? Are you thinking about
I was open. I was not really thinking about church planting. That was a great experience, but I didn't really know hardly anything at that point. At the point that I went to seminary, I had been a Christian for 6 years, a little bit, 6.5 years. So I was still pretty young Christian when I went to seminary. I ended up going to seminary so I didn't have a clear idea. What I knew was that God was drawing me more towards public ministry, teaching and preaching in a way that I couldn't have put my finger on earlier in that window
Right.
where I had known Christ. So I ended up going to seminary in Southern California. There's a good school, good reform school there called Westminster in California. My wife's family all lived in San Diego, Orange County, and so it just made sense that we could be near one of our families and go to seminary. So we moved there, spent 6 really wonderful years in Southern California. We had just gotten married, so it had been recommended to me that we do seminary in 4 years instead of 3. So I picked a slower track anyways. Ended up along the way taking a semester off and working, which was an incredible providence that happened. And maybe I'll tell that story a little bit. So it was an incredible providence that it happened that I had to take this semester off. I had been working in the summers, working real part-time during the school year. And then in the summers, I'd take a big 3 months and make a bunch of money and then go back to school. My wife was working. And one summer, I just couldn't get work. It was very frustrating. There was lots of work out there for the skill set that I had, but everybody wanted you to work 6 months, and I just didn't have 6 months. And about halfway through the summer, we had to decide what we were going to do. We maybe could have scraped through on our savings, or was it wiser just to take a semester off? Well, the Lord led us to take a semester off, and it was, one of those things where you have no idea that how consequential that was going to be. That semester that I took off, I ended up becoming a consultant for a Fortune 500 company. And I was able to work for a Christian lady. And I was introduced into a world of thinking about systems, particularly about how systems work, how people systems work, because the lady that I worked for wanted me to reinvent places that she had responsibility for that weren't working well. Mm-hmm. And so over 4 years, that company gave me more work than I knew what to do with. Yeah. And it was a really incredible experience that very, very few people get to ever have. Mm-hmm. And so here I'm finishing seminary. I'm doing consulting work on the side. Eventually, the church that I interned at hired me part-time. We hoped it would turn into a full-time role, and it didn't end up turning into a full-time role. The church didn't grow quickly enough to support that. And I was doing some preaching, and it was recognizable to the elders in that church and to me, you know what, this is not going quick enough to make this work. Let's just agree to part on great terms, and Matt, you go look for a call where you can preach week by week.
So this is coming to the end of your time at seminary. Right. You're sensing a call to pastoral leadership. At this time, are you thinking about how calls might feel or look different? How one call might feel like revitalization, one call, I mean, like church planting seems to be kind of its own sort of thing.
Right.
Or were you just kind of like a lot of seminarians, like a lot of new ministry leaders thinking, well, church is church is church is church. So I'm just going to go pastor a church that's a normal church.
Yeah, I mean, I think I took the general advice. You should go take a small church and kind of learn what you need to learn. And so that's primarily what I looked at. I was not thinking about churches very much in categories. I wasn't. I don't recall back in those years. This is a long time ago now, but 18 years ago. I don't remember what the form of my brain was then, but it certainly was not. I certainly wasn't thinking like that. I knew enough to be stupid, and that's about it.
So just enough to be dangerous, just like every new seminary. Like as a side note, did I ever tell you my theory of new seminarian's first sermon?
What?
The new seminarian thinks that his first sermon on Lord's Day morning will solve all the problems of Christendom. Of Christendom, yes. Yeah, you will preach one sermon.
And everything comes out. Bada bing.
Yeah, bada bing. It's either that or you are so terrified to preach that you get down in 15 minutes having left half of your outline untouched. That's my theory of new pastors and new seminaries. And it's through your shirt, your jacket, your tie, everything. Yeah, right. Okay, so you take a call to church. Now, this is where you and I first intersected.
Right.
And if you want, I can kind of give the...
Sure.
So the church had been planted 3 years before you came as the pastor. The families that we all lived in the same area, and there was no reformed and evangelical witness in that community. And so there were families coming from a couple different churches, and we all thought, let's have a church close to us and one that we can get to. Maybe we can invite our friends to, but something more convenient for us as a group of families living in this area. This is like the late 90s, and our church planting pastor felt really strongly called to move on, and we weren't in a permanent space. We didn't have anyone helping with music at the time. I think I was playing the piano during part of this season, and I would play the doxology with one finger because I get so nervous.
There was the organist.
We did have an organist for a season. That's true. She was a delightful, kind woman, but it was we were also meeting in
ponderous. She played ponderously.
Yes, and we also happened to meet in a facility down the hall from a massage parlor. So I remember we always had to turn around all the signs on Sunday morning when people would walk in. So that's the first church you walk into as pastor. And you're not thinking in categories of planting or renewal or revitalization.
Nothing.
Just for our listeners, kind of give us a sketch of what did that first call teach you? Sure. How did your first call shape you into the person that is really thinking aggressively and thoughtfully about the renewal of local churches today?
So where things really started to change was a lady came up to me after service one Sunday. I'd been here maybe a year. And she said, "You're a decent preacher," which was probably generous. "And we're nice people. Why isn't our church growing?" And I said to her, "Yeah, oh, absolutely."
Yeah.
And I said to her, "I don't know, but I'll go find out." And this is where sort of like the analytical scientific side of me, my background had been in science. And so, I did science, and then I was a consultant and a business analyst for the Fortune 500 company. And so now suddenly those things start becoming more a part of the way that I thought about pastoring, because I'd never done any analysis of our church. It had never even occurred to me that that's something, feels embarrassing now to say it, but it had never even occurred to me that that's something that you should do, right? That wasn't the lenses that I had. But now here I was forced into it because I didn't know why our church wasn't growing. And I told the lady, well, I don't know why, but I'll go find out. And so what I did was I started reading about church planting, because we were just this side of a church plant. And so I started reading about church planting, and I was like, oh, that's how church planting works. I had no idea, no idea what church planting was or how it was supposed to work. And so it's kind of like, okay, so that's what it was supposed to be shaped like. And so it should have produced this fruit. And what we figured out was, over time, as I began to try and understand all of this, was that our church had some ways in which it was unhealthy. Big surprise. That's the whole New Testament, churches that are unhealthy. So our church was a typical church. It was unhealthy, right?
Right. This is not a slam on that church.
No.
Every church this side of glory is still being formed by Jesus in some way.
It is. Yeah. Think of it as congregational sanctification.
And this is kind of the first time you're starting to think in these terms.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And so I had a previous relationship with a guy named Harry Reeder. I think we've done his book as a resource already. Yep. And I think we've got an interview maybe on tap with him. And so I knew Harry from before, from a different association. And so I took one of my elders and we went to the Embassy of Flame conference, and it was marvelous. I had never had somebody sort of integrate things together for me in a way to go, here's what a healthy church could look like. And so now I suddenly had a grid for, here's what a healthy church could look like. Here's where your church is. And now you got to begin to figure out, what's the pathway to walk to get from where my church is to a healthier state, to a more congregationally sanctified state, right? And so I started to begin to walk that out. And it started to get a lot more difficult, because the church that I was pastoring, the people had actually what they'd been looking for. They had what they wanted. You couldn't fault them. It was a nice church. I was a decent preacher. It was distinctive in the community, but it began to be difficult for me because I wanted to see change happen. And it was a community where change happens very, very slowly, if at all. Mm-hmm. And the people that were there, they had what they were looking for, and so they couldn't imagine why they would change it. And I did not have the patience or the leadership nuance to help even understand what leading change should look like. Yeah. And so I made all the mistakes that everybody makes when you try and induce change without understanding what it actually takes to do that, which is I didn't start with urgency. Yeah. I had urgency, nobody else did, and I didn't help anybody get to where they might have kingdom urgency.
So there was a lot, like, I've so been in this place before. You felt like, I've got to do something.
Right.
And we need to change something. Did you get that, like, why don't you see what I see?
Absolutely.
Why aren't you thinking the way I'm thinking?
Right.
I hear people ask all the time, how do I get my elders on board?
Right.
Almost like with the assumption that they should get it. They should get what I'm getting. And we never think about, I've had this experience. For pastors listening, you think about your church way more than anyone else does.
Absolutely.
And for non-pastors, other ministry leaders, other folks in the pews, if your pastor seems like jazzed up about something, know that he's probably thinking about it like 10 times more, but sometimes we forget to bring people along with us.
And that's exactly right. Yeah. Is that I had taken a journey, but I had not thought carefully about how to take my elders on the same journey.
Right.
And so they had what they were looking for in a church. They did not have any urgency. I had urgency, but I didn't help them gain it. I threw all kinds of ideas out to try and see the church be different, because I could see how it should be becoming different, but that wasn't apparent to them. And I didn't do anything to help it become more apparent to them. And it didn't help that I only took one of my elders to that conference. It's possible that if we'd taken all of them, that it would have been different than it was. And so two of us had the same experience, but the other two elders, they didn't. And so I didn't give them the rails to ride on, is what I would say. And so that didn't go well. I did not handle that well. I could not see at the time my idolatry of success was completely hidden to me. I did not feel like a success. I was very depressed and downcast. I was not in a good place. And that led me basically to look for something else, which is embarrassing to say because most all of that is on me,
So
not on that church.
I think it's important because this is a very interesting conversation. This is 12 years ago, and as you are
I left this church.
that you left this church, and as you are transitioning out, I was starting seminary, and I've had conversations with people today that still talk about the way they grew and were changed and were encouraged by that season of ministry. So I think it's important for us to not ever, when we tell a renewal story,
right,
to never tell, to some degree, to never tell the story like it has a sad ending.
right.
Because Jesus is working. He
Right.
works through the preaching of the word. He works through the fellowship of believers.
Absolutely.
Even small churches that are trying to find their way, he's still doing good things.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I think that that's worth, because most of the time when we have this conversation with people, it's they've been the pastor, but we have this unique moment here where I was the parishioner and you were the pastor in this episode of your life.
Right, right.
And so I just want to reflect on the fact that, like, I can still remember. I remember one of your last 3 sermons was on hospitality.
Oh,
and
yeah.
to this day, that issue of hospitality shapes how I pastored and then shapes my family. So
That's cool.
we need to give thanks to God.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Harry Readers.
Good things were done here.
Yeah,
The VeggieTales would say, good things were done here.
Well, and Harry Reader always says, remember, repent, recover, in his kind of dynamic in Embers. And part of the remember part is remember the good that God has done. To renew a church, you do need to celebrate the good things God has been doing in that church
for sure
over time. So let's shift now. We have a few more minutes. I think we're going to make this a 2-part episode because there was in the last dozen years, you pastored a second church and then moved into this role working for Flourish and trying to advance the conversation about church renewal beyond one congregation, but to multiple churches. So we want to kind of do that, but let's talk a little bit about that transition.
Sure.
You were open to a new call.
Right.
Were you beginning to think self-consciously, I want to pastor a church that is in acute need of renewal or revitalization?
Absolutely not.
Which is what most pastors would say, I think.
So there's 3 things that intersected at the transition from the first church that I pastored to the second church that I pastored. One was I had run into Tim Keller's teaching about the centrality of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife and I had printed out that essay, and we both read it and underlined it and highlighted it. And it was part of our bedtime conversation. Towards the end of my ministry in my first church, we had begun to talk about that in our men's group. And so that renovation about the gospel being the central thing had begun. And that was a very significant domino but it was towards the end of my first ministry that was almost 6 years long. The second domino that happened at the end of that ministry was the Lord was convincing me that I had conceived of life incorrectly. And so I had always been a person, even as a pastor, where I conceived of weeks as a series of tasks between which you inserted people. And the Lord was completely flipping that on its head and helping me see that ministry, particularly ministry, was to be about a week was a series of appointments with people between which you did tasks. And that was very, very earth-shaking for me. Most people who meet me now, they're just like, what? You were not a people person? You were not a people-oriented person at one point? And I'm like, yeah, you didn't know me back then. It wasn't pleasant. My wife can tell you, it was not pleasant. And the Lord just did a very significant work that it is, and it is the Lord's work, that it's unrecognizable for people to think that that's the way that I used to live life. And I'm very thankful. It's a more difficult life, but it's a much more rewarding and fulfilling and satisfying life to live people-oriented. And so those couple of things were going on at the same time, all towards the end, right? So the gospel is becoming central to me as a person and to the way that I think about leading and preaching and in the church. I'm becoming people-oriented rather than task-oriented, right, in my orientation towards the way I think about ministry. The third intersection was I was done with unhealthy church.
Mm.
And so I told the Lord, we're looking for another call, but we're looking for a healthy church. And so I was really careful. I researched churches. I only applied to churches that I knew were healthy, like I knew the reputation, everything.
Right, but isn't that such a blinder view?
It was a blinder view.
Yeah.
And the Lord was so fit.
Oh, this church is fine. They're fine. I'll go pastor them.
So I got turned down by every single healthy church that I applied to.
Pause for a moment. Now, looking back, would you say, oh, there is no such thing as a healthy church?
They were probably healthier.
Sure. But you would have got there, and there would have been some deformity in the gospel. There would have been some...
Absolutely.
Because no church is perfectly healthy this side of heaven. Right.
It's not. All of them need ongoing sanctification.
Right.
But I certainly was not looking for, a train wreck, a church that was on the verge of closing, that kind of thing. I was again it.
Right.
Right. And every single one of them turned me down. Some of them after they heard my preaching, which was really delightful. And it was after one of these churches, I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it was 13 years ago. They turned me down after they heard my preaching. And I was just despondent. And the Lord just, the Lord just got a hold of me. And what I sensed he was trying to say to me was, I didn't give you this experience so you could go to a healthy church. I gave you this experience so you could go to a dying church and maybe help it. I was not expecting that.
Mm.
One of the difficulties that I ran into in the part of the world that we're sitting in right now as we record this is that I didn't culturally fit the area. And one of the friends that I made here said to me, cultural fit's important, Matt. You should think about maybe a different kind of cultural fit if you're going to take another call. And he'd recommended that I maybe try a city instead of a semi-rural area or one of the coasts. Well, as it turned out, there was a dying old Presbyterian church in Seattle that knew it was on its last legs and was looking for somebody to come and help it change. And so once the Lord got a hold of me and convinced me that maybe healthy churches was not the place I was supposed to go, and that church knew what they were looking for, and we met and made fast friends.
So you used a pretty stark description there, a dying old church. Would any of the people in that church said, we are a dying old church?
Absolutely.
See,
they were self-conscious.
Right.
Half the church was 75 or older.
Right.
They knew, just looking at the budget numbers, they had an enormous facility. They had a congregation that had been declining for 30 years under the previous pastor's ministry, 17-year ministry, faithful guy, wonderful man. Their church went from 200 to 100 over 17 years.
Mm.
And continuing to decline because of that 100, half of them were 75 or older. Some of them were infirm. They couldn't come to church anymore. So you had very, very little to work with. They almost closed the Sunday school because there weren't any children.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was, they could own, we are an old dying church and we're going to need to change. And that was helpful because they had that moment of clarity that it's going to have to be very different in order for us to go forward.
There's a nexus there, right? When a church gets a grip on their reality and they are ready for a new pastor, there's a nexus there. There's a kind of a moment there where there's a heightened possibility of change.
Right. So we say that renewal happens when the right pastor, so someone who fits well in a cultural spot, goes to the right congregation. So a guy who's equipped to be a pastor for renewal goes to the right congregation, there's a cultural fit there at the right time. They're aware of their need and they want to change.
Right.
And so that nexus happened. Yeah. Right. You're talking about.
Yeah. I think that it's important to note that there are a lot of guys who are going to end up pastoring what on paper will look like a renewal or revitalization work to some greater or lesser degree of acuity.
Right.
But few of those guys are thinking about themselves that way, and few congregations are thinking about themselves that way.
Right.
And if they're thinking about it at all, it's usually let's get back to. Let's get back to when things were easy and comfortable.
Or let's get a young pastor because he'll attract new young people.
Because he'll attract young people.
And he's the silver bullet.
Let's get a young pastor with 15 years experience.
Right. That impossible profile. Yeah.
Who doesn't want a living wage. Let's get that guy.
Right,
and
exactly.
And his wife will...
And we don't have to change.
And his wife will work full-time for the church.
Yes.
Let's find that person, and that will save our church. I'm so sorry. If you're a member... I'm sorry, that's a little bit of cynical pastor side of church life coming out on my part, but it is there's a lot of people who believe that the pastor will save the church, and if they believe the church needs saving at all. There's a lot of pastors who sadly believe that they can save the church. I want to unpack this journey with that new church, but I think we should say that that we kind of cap our conversation here and we pick it up in the next episode. How did you go from self-conscious renewal pastor to moving into this role as a renewal leader in the circles that you run in, and kind of finish the story that way?
Sure.
But as we wrap up, maybe one final reflection on the transition from your first to your second call, and how the start of your second call was different than the start of your first call.
Yeah, I think that I went in to the second call with some sketch of an idea of how I thought I needed to lead. And I had none of that in the first call. So the second call, I realized that assessment was a critical thing. And so even through the whole interview process, I was assessing things and asking lots of questions and asking for documents and talking to people. And by the time I got on the ground, I had an idea of a direction that we needed to go, that the gospel needed to be reasserted as central, right? And that the church needed to have some kind of unifying vision going forward. And so I knew those things hitting the ground in a way where I was just blind in the first call. And so it's as different as they could be, actually.
I mean, some of that was just life maturity, but some of that was the Holy Spirit having formed you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, thank you for sharing the opening part of your story. We'll pick up the next part of your story in our next episode. And you ready to talk about some hard stuff? Some conflict?
Please.
Yep. This is
hard
good
stuff.
This is good processing. You've been listening to the Church Renewal podcast in our Renewal Stories series, where we talk to people who have experienced personal gospel renewal or attempted to lead gospel renewal in their church. We have these conversations because we believe that hearing about the ways God is at work will encourage us to be intentional and thoughtful about the way we lead renewal wherever God has called us. We do these podcasts from Flourish because we believe that there is only one fully sufficient reason that this day dawned, and it is that Jesus is still on the move, calling people to himself, and the regular way he does that is through the ministry of the church. So if you'd like to hear about the ways Flourish helps congregations and pastors do that, reach out to us. Find us on Twitter and Facebook at Flourish Coaching. Reach out to me, your podcast host, by email. I'm Allan, ALLAN, at flourishcoaching.org. We would love for you to continue this journey with us as we dig into the ways that Jesus is renewing his church.